It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Sunlight Reflection Briefing. My name is David Biello, and I'm the Science Curator at TED. And I am very excited for today because we get to learn about a technology that could help save us from global warming. We're in a crisis and we have a responsibility, but it's also an opportunity to create the world that we want. And that's what these technologies could allow us to do. And that world that we want, or that I want anyway, includes a stable climate. And so hopefully we can come together today to learn about the opportunity to build that world we want.
The first slide here is based in my hometown, Canberra, Australia, and it was taken in January this year when massive bushfires were threatening the city. This was totally unprecedented. We're a continent that's used to fires, but we had never seen fires of the intensity and the scale that we have seen 6 months ago. And we know very well why the fires were so unprecedented, why we saw fires of the intensity that we did. And that's because of climate change. That's because the heat in the Earth's atmosphere has been increasing, particularly since the mid-20th century. But to really understand why these conditions are so unprecedented, we need to go back longer than a century or so in time. This graph is a record of Earth's temperature for 2,000 years, so the zero on the left here is the time of the Roman Empire, and you see the natural variability of the climate. But it's very well bounded between only about 0.1 of a degree on either side of the average. And that held all the way through those 2,000 years until the last century or so. The spike at the end is the human influence. This is the CO2-driven heating from burning fossil fuels. If we look toward the future, climate models simulate what could happen by 2100 depending on our rate of emissions. But to again understand the real importance of this, we need to look at that much longer time frame. If we put those projections on to the 2,000-year time frame, 2100 is about here. That looks like this really sharp wedge going up toward 4 or 5 degrees. So we can see that we are already committed to 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. That's already built into the system. We cannot avoid that. So we have more impacts yet to come. But the real danger is if we let this system get out of control and go up to 4 or 5 degrees, a much hotter state. Most experts think that that is a severe challenge to contemporary civilization, with collapse of civilization being a possibility. Now, the interesting thing is we could get to these higher temperatures not just by human emissions alone, but by a phenomenon called tipping points. These are parts of the Earth's system that can change when they are forced past a certain point. So let's have a look at what these tipping points are and how they operate and why they could be so dangerous for us in the future. We know what they look like. They come in 3 basic types. They're big masses of ice, either floating on the surface like the Arctic sea ice, or on land like Greenland or West Antarctica. And of course they can melt as the Earth warms. They're big ecosystems or biomes, the Amazon rainforest, the big northern forests in Canada and Siberia, and circulation systems like the Atlantic Ocean circulation or the jet stream in the atmosphere. These are linked and they can act like a row of dominoes. So the real concern here is that we could activate a tipping cascade if we let this system go on. So already in the year 2020, we can see that several of these tipping points are already activated, as we say. Arctic sea ice is reducing in area. The Atlantic Ocean is slowing down. Ice sheets in Greenland and West Antarctica are losing mass. There are more droughts in the Amazon rainforest. In our analysis, we made this very important quote: if damaging tipping cascades can occur and a global tipping point cannot be ruled out, then this is an existential threat to civilization. No amount of economic cost-benefit analysis is going to help us. So for several 100,000 years, the Earth oscillated between ice ages and warm periods. And the latest warm period is the era in which humans developed our civilizations that we know today. But already our greenhouse gas emissions have pushed us out of this system of ice ages and warm periods and into this very shallow, hotter valley, which is not a very stable zone in itself. So this Earth is already moving away from its stable state, and it's moving toward a fork in the road. Now, we've talked about one fork in the road. That's the dangerous one where we initiate this tipping cascade, and we go over what we depict here as a planetary threshold or cliff, which takes us into the 4 or 5 degree area, hothouse Earth. One way we can analyze this danger is to look at what's called intervention time and reaction time. So here we have some emission reduction pathways from the IPCC. And what we describe as reaction time is the time it takes to actually hit net zero emissions. So when this line comes down to zero. It's depicted here as 2060. But let's be optimistic and say we can hit net zero 10 years before that at 2050, just as many governments and other jurisdictions are now legislating for net zero by 2050. So that's the time it's going to take us to really get the system back under control. But then the intervention time is how much time we have left to actually stop or minimize the risk of these tipping points. And we can actually put some numbers there too. So the estimates are Arctic sea ice, well, we're probably almost at the tipping point today. West Antarctic ice sheet, maybe a decade in the future, we'll be tipping that. Amazon forest, 15 years, although the latest research says that could be optimistic. Greenland ice sheet, maybe 25 years. So here we have 4 tipping points where the times we think we have left to stop them from tipping are shorter than the time we have to hit net zero emissions. So that's saying we already are in quite a dangerous situation, that we are at risk of starting a tipping cascade. So that raises the question, are we already losing control of the system? That's why it's so important over the next few years to take very strong and definitive action on climate change.
What we'll describe very powerfully are the risks associated with the first order problem we have of heat stress on natural systems. This heat stress operates a bit like a fever on the human body. So as that fever rises, systems can start to break down, leading to exponential changes that must be prevented to ensure safety. Where we are today is that for responses to climate that have a very meaningful impact on heat energy in the climate system within 30 years, our portfolio is light and our cupboard is bare. And so from SilverLining's point of view, we think this puts us in an unacceptable position of risk exposure to near-term climate change. And what Will talked about, we have a lot of uncertainty as to what the climate system will do in the next decade, 2 decades, or 3 decades. There's a point where the natural system starts to contribute to climate change in a way that could outpace any human ability to respond to it. And it's very essential that we don't hit that point. And so we think that it's a very important part of our role, all of us here collectively together, to ensure that we have sufficient measures to provide safety to people and protection for natural systems. And so one possibility that we're all going to talk about with you today is the idea of reflecting sunlight from the atmosphere. So scientists over the past couple of decades have looked at the question of, if you needed to respond to climate change quickly, and particularly within a few years or a decade or two, what are the most promising approaches? And in 2015, the National Academy of Sciences in the United States did a study where they determined that the most promising approach is based on one of the ways that nature regulates temperature, and that is the reflection of sunlight from clouds and particles in the atmosphere. What you're seeing here is a NASA simulation of the movement of clouds and particles in the atmosphere. Scientists hypothesized that increasing this reflectivity by just 1% might offset a doubling of CO2 or several degrees of warming. And so that's the foundation for what we're talking about today. They base their hypothesis on observations from nature. And one of them is what happens when very large volcanoes erupt. When Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, it was sufficiently powerful that it pushed material all the way into the outer layer of the atmosphere, the stratosphere, where it circulated for a time until it fell back to Earth. And it produced a measurable cooling of the planet by about 0.5 degrees C for almost 2 years. And this was due to the reflection of sunlight from the particles directly circulating clouds in the outer atmosphere. This also led to a notable recovery of Arctic ice in the year after Pinatubo erupted. So you can see here in the ice record, there was this recovery, and then the Arctic ice receded again. So based on these kinds of observations, scientists arrived at the hypothesis that there might be a way to produce this actively. And similarly, what you're seeing here is bright streaks created in the lower cloud layer off the Pacific West Coast of the United States. These streaks are created by the particle emissions from ships. And this effect is known as the cloud aerosol effect, and it's actually produced by the particulates in emissions, more of what we think of as the dirty particles, and the way that they mix with clouds that often has the effect of making them a little bit brighter. Scientists believe that this cloud aerosol effect, this slight brightening that our pollutants are producing, is leading to a cooling effect of somewhere between 0.5 degree and 1.1 degrees C. So while we have the warming of greenhouse gases, we have currently today a form of sunlight reflection that's created by human activity that is cooling the planet at scale that we don't understand very well. But this cloud brightening effect is related to one idea that scientists have had in terms of sunlight reflection to cool climate. And so they postulated that there might be a way to optimize this effect over the ocean using tiny particles of sea salt in a sort of cleaner, more natural way to brighten clouds in specific parts of the ocean where in doing that, you might actually create a global cooling effect. In fact, early model studies suggested that by brightening just somewhere between 10 and 20% of these marine clouds, which represent about 3 to 5% of the ocean surface, you might be able to offset a doubling of CO2. The more prominent idea in this category is the idea related to what very large volcanoes do when they go off, the dispersion of particles into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight directly. Scientists have a fairly high degree of confidence in this effect based on what they've seen with volcanoes. What they don't know as much about is what the longer term, medium and longer term side effects might be of this type of alteration of the composition of the stratosphere. And so that's what they'd like to study. But in terms of the potential benefits, what I'm showing you here is a simulation from NCAR. It's the first ever simulation using a global climate model with an overlay of a controlled ejection of particles into the stratosphere to produce cooling, starting in 2020 and moving through the end of the century. And this is a model comparison of conditions under the high emissions scenario, RCP 8.5, versus the scenario where particles are introduced to the stratosphere to produce cooling. And the result that you can see here is a marked difference in the surface conditions of the planet. So with this type of intervention, we're able to keep the surface temperatures of the planet relatively close to those of today. Without it, those temperatures become very, very different conditions for livability, survivability, and ecosystems. But as I said, there are a lot of effects that we don't understand. And in order to understand and project what these approaches might do, involves actually improving our ability to observe and predict the Earth system. Right now, we are actually underinvested in the capabilities that we need for observations of the parts of the system that are most critical to these questions, including surface and aerial observations, certain space-based observations, and tipping points. And we are underinvested in climate model predictions and the science that goes with them to help us improve our ability to forward project what the climate system is doing for all of these kinds of questions. For these sunlight reflection interventions, those predictions are critical. And so this is kind of surfacing where our investment gaps are in climate research and climate forecasting capabilities in general. In addition to that, we need directed scientific research on these individual techniques. And so that's one of the reasons that we're here today, is to see how that research is emerging, where we might be able to catalyze it forward and catalyze it in ways that activates public sector money and complements public sector money. So this is a really exciting area. I'm excited to talk to everyone here on the phone because I want to emphasize that climate prediction and the climate system is the largest complex systems question on planet Earth. The only sort of bigger computing problem and bigger systems analysis problem is the entire universe, is astrophysics. So this is a hard problem. It requires computing resources. It requires complex systems analysis. It requires a lot of disciplines to work through. At the same time, there's low-hanging fruit to sort of catalyze this, move forward answers to key questions quickly. And so there's also the notion here that, you know, we in the United States do not operate in isolation, and others in the world may start to explore these techniques. And so understanding whether they are in fact useful parts of a climate portfolio or sort of emergency response function, or whether we need to understand them in order to engage with others who may try them and may try them in ways that are unwise. We think both of those questions are really, really important and are drivers for what we're doing here. Ultimately, especially in the near term, this is a deep matter of social justice. And it may be important that we in the West take responsibility to prevent the most dire impacts from happening in the next 10, 20, 30 years. There was a recent study that said that as many as 3 billion people, the places that they live in could become unlivable by 2050. From our perspective at SilverLining, that's unacceptable. And it's our responsibility and our duty to make sure that we use all of the knowledge, technology, and capabilities that we have to keep the world safe for all of its people, especially its most vulnerable ones. So on that note, I'll say one of the lessons of 2020 that we've learned is the importance of science-based decision-making. And so for these questions, in terms of how we respond in the climate portfolio and whether we might be introducing technological capabilities as a response to some of the acute threats that we face, we need to prioritize science-based decision-making in these cases. And in order to do that, we need science. We have, as a people, done this very successfully. I have up here the Montreal Protocol as one example of an existential threat that we have addressed incredibly successfully as a world community following the science. And we're confident or hopeful that we could do the same thing here. In order to do that, we need quite a bit more science than we have today. In fact, scientists in the field think we have a decade of research to do just to assess whether or not you would invest to scale these sort of approaches, whether they belong in the climate portfolio. We're hoping that that can be accelerated maybe to a 5 to 7 year time horizon. So this is just the assessment research so that we can determine whether or not these things are viable solutions. Events may move faster than that. So everything that we do this year, next year, to catalyze this work has a really, really profound impact on what might happen in this field and indeed what might happen to climate.
We don't have a complete picture of how the stratosphere works. We simply need to know what's in the stratosphere in more detail. And so climate intervention proposals and the anticipation that this might come about simply heightens the need and the urgency on our part to figure this out before the world would come to a policy decision. One of the really important distinctions about our laboratory is that we make large investments in what we call in situ observations. Satellites rotate around the Earth and they make remote sensing observations, but to actually go to the stratosphere, sample air directly and find out what's there, both for gases and particles. And that's where our lab really excels. We have quite a long history of doing that and a capability. If one is going to perturb the stratosphere with material, you want to be able to demonstrate that you know what is happening. What is that material doing, both chemically, composition, and radiatively? And this aircraft could essentially go anywhere in the planet, and if you have the right instruments, tell you that. One of our more clever, innovative instruments that we've come up with is called POPs. Can be put on a lot of platforms. It measures individual particles. There really is no other instrument in the world that can do this mission in the sense of hand launched at the surface and go to 100,000 feet and measure the number and size of particles all along that trajectory. This is a huge leap forward. This instrument, again, has no other duplicates in the world, can measure extremely small amounts of SO2 quite reliably. Why do you want to measure SO2? It's both nature and humans produce that at the surface of the Earth. And meteorology carries that molecule to the lower stratosphere. Its fate is to turn into particles. It gets oxidized to form sulfuric acid. And so knowing the background stratosphere means that we will need to understand that process. So this instrument, both the POPs that measures particles and SO2 that measures the precursors to particles, are extremely important tools.
So I'm really an atmospheric scientist focusing quite a lot on the chemical process in the atmosphere. I feel very similarly with Dave that before we go perturb the system, I think we really need to make sure we understand that system that we're perturbing well. SCOPEX is the stratospheric controlled perturbation experiment. So the goal of the experiment is to go with a stratospheric balloon similar to the ones David Fay mentioned, a little bit larger than what you saw in those pictures for sure. And this contains both the equipment in the end for making a small plume of aerosol and the instruments to actually understand this. We do this experiment to look at a subset of questions that will help us understand some of the risks better and the efficacy of stratospheric geoengineering.
So I'm Sarah Doherty, and I'm going to talk about the Marine Cloud Brightening Project. We're all familiar with the fact that greenhouse gas increases from human activities are warming climate. At the same time, the particulate pollution that we're emitting is cooling climate and offsetting some of that warming. So the idea behind Marine Cloud Brightening is to leverage the same effect, but to our benefit and applied in a more controlled way. Currently, the effects of particulate pollution on clouds is both significant, as you can see here, but it's also highly uncertain. It's actually the largest source of uncertainty in how humans are driving climate change. And the research that we will be doing under Marine Cloud Brightening will help address many of the same questions that need to be answered to reduce this large uncertainty in how humans are driving climate change inadvertently. So we know from research to date that the most efficient way to intentionally brighten clouds is to try and do so in the marine environment by augmenting natural sea salt aerosol population. And the idea is to use ocean water to generate sea salt particles of a size that's optimized to brighten the clouds. And in an experimental setting, we could do this in a very localized way and in a way where the effects would last very briefly, maybe a few days. So a fairly safe thing to do in an experimental setting. If you go to the implementation scale, the sea salt particles would be added to clouds using a fleet of ships located in very targeted specific regions of the ocean, where a type of marine low clouds called stratocumulus clouds are very present most of the time and are very persistent. And the reason you would target stratocumulus clouds is because this type of cloud is very susceptible to brightening with the addition of particles. Stratocumulus clouds cover about a quarter of the open ocean. Unfortunately for us, this type of cloud is concentrated in three main regions that you can see circled on this map here off the west coast of North America, South America, and Central Africa. We can see from global modeling studies that even if you only apply it in these three regions, you still get cooling effects over the entire globe. So the concept behind marine cloud brightening is pretty straightforward, and it appears that a realistic implementation of MCB could be used to significantly cool global climate. But in reality, it's a lot more complicated. We haven't had the ability to do basically controlled perturbation experiments like you would in sort of any area of science where you want to have a control case against which to compare. So one of the great things about marine cloud brightening research and this spray system that Sean's going to talk about is that it would present us with the opportunity to do these perturbation field experiments and build observational systems around them to answer questions that we haven't been able to answer as well by simply going in and passively observing systems where things are just co-varying in a way that makes them hard to pull apart. And this is, doing this type of field experiment, the idea of getting to do controlled injections is a new and exciting area, but the going out and actually making measurements of aerosols, of clouds, of the aerosol cloud interactions, and how the clouds respond is something we actually have a lot of experience with. And there's aircraft from various federal agencies that we've used, NSF, NOAA, NASA, all have aircraft that we've used to do these types of observations. We typically pull together teams of instrumentalists from all over the country, and they each will put their specialized instrument into the aircraft so that we can measure everything from the aerosol size to the cloud radiation, and get a good constraint on all those different variables in the system. So this part of it is something we really have a lot of experience with and know how to do very well. Of course, with this area, there's lots of new exciting developments going on with both surface-based and aircraft-based drones. The small instrument package development, such as the POPs instrument, is something that we could potentially use here. So we're also looking to try and use the tools that we have are well established and we've used in the past, as well as some exciting new instrumentation that's and platforms that are starting to be used in our field. And with that, I will wrap it up.
My name is Sean Garner. I'm a vice president here at PARC and the director of the Hardware Systems Laboratory. And so first I'd like to tell you a little bit about PARC itself. So PARC is a wholly owned subsidiary of Xerox. It was founded in 1970 with a mission to create the office of the future. So this is the famous Alto computer that you see behind me here. And this set the template for personal computers as we know them today. But a lot of people don't realize that PARC does a lot of other research, including in climate and energy. All right, so let's go downstairs and I can show you the lab where we do the marine cloud brightening work. We work on technologies from advanced sensing to advanced manufacturing. On the advanced manufacturing side, we've been exploring technologies in aerosol deposition of materials. So aerosol processing is really important in a lot of industries, and there are a lot of materials that one would like to process as an aerosol. And there's a couple reasons for that. You might want to create a very thin coating of a material, or you might want to create very small particles of a material, say by drying an aerosol. There are some fluids, though, that can't be aerosolized by traditional means, but we've invented a method shown here at PARC that does allow you to aerosolize these fluids. And so this is one of the things that we study in my lab. It's difficult with nozzles to make very small particles, especially in very high volumes. And so for marine cloud brightening, we would really need a lot of particles in a pretty small size range. So nozzles that are most of the nozzles that you'd use in industry. So here I'm showing, an automotive painting operation. The particles of paint there would be probably at least 1,000 times too big for our application here. There's another technique called effervescent atomization, and it turns out that breaks this relationship. So by forcing a gas through the orifice with the fluid, you can see on the slide the fluid can form this kind of annulus around the gas, and there's it sort of explodes outward when it exits the nozzle on the other side. You can break that relationship and create very small particles, but with a high flow rate. So this is a technique that seems promising and one that we're investigating actively now for use in marine cloud brightening. So our next steps really are to, as I mentioned, continue to study the effects of multiple nozzles in an indoor environment. And then funding permitting, we'd like to move into larger scale experiments, so possibly in a large indoor environment, but really start to build a system that could be taken outdoors so we could actually measure the effect that this would have on marine clouds.
And to me, it's clear that many international scientific and policy bodies recognize the need to research climate intervention methodologies, including stratospheric aerosol injection and cloud brightening techniques. This isn't new, as we've heard. Many of these efforts have been underway for decades. The IPCC, for example, has been assessing research on these topics for over a decade, and about 10 years ago held an expert meeting to best determine how to assess these technologies in our reports in terms of effectiveness, feasibility, scalability, cost, and societal concerns. What is new, what feels new to me, is the information in recent reports, IPCC among many others, that show just how challenging it is to meet internationally agreed targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and forestalling some of the most dire consequences of climate change, including passing some key tipping points. So in a report that we released in September of 2018 on the effects of 1.5 degrees of warming, this was a report that was requested by the Paris Agreement of the IPCC. We concluded that in order to mitigate the most severe effects of climate change, the world would need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by roughly 50% between that time, 2018 and 2030, and reach net zero emissions by mid-century. A mitigation pathway that we deemed technologically feasible, but frankly does not seem politically plausible. Carbon dioxide removal of some sort was part of every scenario that could limit warming to 1.5 degrees, be it bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, or increased afforestation. But solar radiation management was not included in any of the scenarios. However, the report did conclude if mitigation efforts do not keep global mean temperature below 1.5 degrees, solar radiation management can potentially reduce the climate impacts of a temporary temperature overshoot, in particular extreme temperatures, rate of sea level rise, and intensity of tropical cyclones, which are some of the major impacts that people are actually quite concerned with. The report did note the importance of doing this alongside intense mitigation and adaptation efforts, as Chris was kind of alluding to. But there was high agreement that the injection of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere could help limit temperature rise to the most ambitious targets of the Paris Accord. Again, there were potential impacts and risks that were discussed as well. So there is a balance here. But honestly, I would say more than a decade of research into these topics has not yielded enough information at the international level for many decision makers to feel they have enough information to underpin action.
At the Pritzker Innovation Fund, we focus our philanthropy on both climate change and on reducing global inequities in our approaches to climate change, which is why it's important to us that in addition to the obvious possible reduction in climate risk this research could have, it also has the potential to reduce climate impacts on the world's most vulnerable. While aiming to reduce global emissions is incredibly important, developing countries also have a moral imperative to use more energy to lift their populations out of poverty, which means we need abundant clean energy technologies that can be deployed in various developing world contexts. They'll also need the infrastructure to protect them from these climate risks. Research into ways to reduce these risks could have an extraordinary impact on the world's most vulnerable. This is also why it's important to include researchers and other stakeholders from developing countries early in this process. I find this both inspiring and hopeful, and I hope you enjoy hearing more about this today and also in future conversations we convene to dive deeper into the policy and governance issues as well.
Even though we have made great progress on examining regional impacts of climate intervention, we've really only just scratched the surface. We need many more simulations to consider the full range of scenarios that is likely to occur with climate intervention using stratospheric aerosols. WACOM has been in development at NCAR for over 20 years, and what's unique about WACOM, as it has fully interactive atmospheric, ocean, land, and sea ice models. The atmospheric model in particular extends really high into the atmosphere, so it captures the stratosphere and even the mesosphere. And the chemistry module in this model is one of the most extensive that are available, and it's capturing not only the chemistry in the stratosphere, but also last year we developed a fully tropospheric chemistry module that we have working in our model today. In 2017, with a team of researchers, not only from NCAR, but also from Cornell University and PNNL, we created GLENS, or the first geoengineering large ensemble using stratospheric aerosols that were placed in the stratosphere in a very controlled way to minimize the side effects of such an intervention. As part of GLENS, we ran 20 simulations from year 2020 to year 2100, in which we only changed very slightly the initial condition in our simulations. With this enormous data set, we could begin examining the probabilities of warming and cooling, wetting and drying on a regional scale. We need a large number of simulations because there is natural variability in the climate system, which is very analogous to why we need multiple simulations of a weather forecast. and the forecast is always a probability and not only one answer. So we started our model with 20 different initial conditions, and in time, those scenarios differ from one another, and which lets us examine the range of probabilities for different regions of the world, what our climate may look like if we apply climate intervention using stratospheric aerosols. So under the RCP 8.5 scenario, all climate model, including the NCAR's model, predicts that the temperatures, especially by the end of the century, will be much warmer than what they are now in every part of the globe. When we strategically apply intervention with stratospheric aerosols, the temperatures everywhere in the world will be much more similar to what they are now than under the high emission scenario. In our simulations, we also found that sea ice, which is projected to entirely disappear in high emission scenario simulations, can be restored using climate intervention using stratospheric aerosols, and that restoration can be to present day levels. Moving forward, it's also critical for us to keep examining the uncertainties in our climate projections and improving our Earth system models. We hope to be able to contribute more to climate intervention research. A big part of NCAR's mission is providing the community the tools that they need to perform their research. Hence, our models are freely available to the community, and we partner with universities and other national labs in their usage. So moving forward, we'd like to use our expertise in climate change and variability research and work with the external community to solve this problem in the entire world.
So I'm Doug McMartin from Cornell University, and I'll talk about our work into climate engineering. I'll start by pointing out I use the term climate engineering rather than something like intervention quite deliberately. We're aiming for a more holistic assessment of geoengineering or climate engineering. That includes a more systematic approach to thinking about uncertainty for different strategies and how you could deploy. I'll say more about that in a moment. And for different scenarios, all with the aim of informing both policy and understanding future research needs. So our acronym for all of that is GAUSS. So if you're a policymaker, two obvious questions. What are the benefits and risks? And how confident are we in that? And the problem is there's a third question, which is benefits and risks of what? So how you do this matters. So the default assumption would be that you fly aircraft up to the stratosphere and release material, but how high do you go matters. Higher is better, but it's harder. The latitude you put material at makes a huge, huge difference. You're looking at a map of the Arctic here showing summer sea ice extent in two different simulations of using stratospheric aerosol injection later this century when rising temperatures would mean there otherwise wouldn't be any sea ice left. The one on the left puts the aerosols in at the equator, the way basically everybody else has always simulated it. And on the right, we picked 4 different latitudes and then used a feedback algorithm that learned how much to put in at each latitude to do a better job. So the point here is that these things matter. It matters to think about this as a design problem that can be optimized. The other observation to make here is that the only way that we can project what would happen if somebody were to do this, other than doing it, just sort of defeat the point, is using climate models. We can validate those to some extent with observations after volcanic eruptions, but there's always going to be uncertainty. And so the other thread to weave through here is how to think about that.
I am Lili Xia. I'm a research associate at Rutgers University. I'm working at the Rutgers Impact Study of Climate Intervention Lab. And in this lab, we really focus on agricultural impacts, ecosystem impacts, and air pollutant impacts. And here, I'm just going to talk about agricultural impacts. If we put extra aerosol in the atmosphere, it will block the sunlight, which means less solar radiation reaching the surface, which reduces the surface temperature and also change precipitation pattern. And something very special is those aerosols in the atmosphere will scatter the sunlight, which cause more diffuse radiation. And also the aerosols in the atmosphere has the potential to destroy the ozone layer. And that will change the surface ultraviolet radiation and the surface ozone concentration. So none of those unique features has been really considered in crop modeling studies, diffuse radiation and UV and ozone on the surface. climate modeling groups and the crop modeling groups, they need to talk with each other and have a really standard procedure to solve this problem. So currently, our lab is using the most sophisticated Earth system model, CSM2, to run couple simulations. This model is very advanced because it has an interactive crop model, and also it has an ozone damage function, which means we can use it to study how surface ozone change will impact agriculture. So we use this model, did a bunch of simulations. So in general, you will see with the cooling effect of climate intervention, there will be a big increase of corn production globally. But there's a big regional differences. So let's look at some specific scenarios, one climate intervention and one global warming. And if we look at the difference between those two curves, the map on the right is showing the difference between climate intervention and the global warming, how the corn production will change. And actually here we can confirm what we said before, like over the tropical region, there's a lot of green areas. Those regions are showing corn production increase, but over the high latitude regions such as Russia, the brown color they're showing there's a big decrease of corn production. So just to summarize what we know on this topic, temperature reduction from solar climate intervention will benefit crop production in general, but we need to notice there's a big regional differences, and that's actually what we should focus on.
I'm Andy Parker and I direct the SRM Governance Initiative, SRM GI, and I've worked on SRM for just over 12 years. We're an international non-governmental project and we seek to build the capacity of developing countries to evaluate SRM. We focus on developing countries because, simply put, SRM matters more to the global south. If it works well to reduce climate risks, then developing countries have got the most to gain. If it all goes wrong, then developing countries have the most to lose, but they are not well represented in research and discussion, and that is why we have our focus. And the way we work is, well, two main methods. For the last decade, our main stock in trade has been outreach workshops. We gather together the local climate community to talk about SRM, to talk about the science and the governance and what this might mean for local climate policy and the potential risks and so on. And so in 2018, we launched the second plank of our work, the Decimals Fund, and that's Developing Country Impact Modelling Analysis for SRM, Decimals. This is the world's first international SRM research fund, the first aimed exclusively at developing countries. And now 8 teams of scientists, 45 scientists in total, are researching SRM and are asking questions that matter locally.
Hello, my name is Ines Camiloni. I'm a climate scientist from Argentina. As a climate expert, I've been the author on different IPCC reports. Our study on the Decimals project has as a main goal to explore the possible impacts of solar radiation management on La Plata Basin. This is the 5th freshwater basin in the world. The water is used for the production of hydroelectricity and also for agricultural activities and also for navigability. This location is the Itaipú Dam. This is a very important dam. Any possible changes in the water availability would have important implications in the production of hydroelectricity, for example. We produce different scenarios of changes for the flow of the Paraná River at this location. They show that we can expect some positive results coming from the solar radiation management and some negative results associated to the implementation of this technology. In terms of changes in mean flows and the geoengineering scenario, we can expect an increase. And this can be the positive result because we can increase the production of energy if we have more water. Under solar radiation management, there will be an increase in low flows. This means that drought conditions will be not as severe as, for example, are now in our region, where we are suffering the most important drought in the last 50 years. But on the contrary, when we compare these results with the high flows, what we found is that under a solar radiation management scenario, the high flows will be higher compared to the high emission scenario. And in this sense, we can expect more intense floods in the margins of the Paraná River. And consequently, there's important to say that more research is needed to assess with more detail what can be the possible effects of the solar radiation management in our region.
Hi, I'm Isidine Pinto, and I'm a researcher at the Climate System Analysis Group, which is a research center at the University of Cape Town. And we are part of a researcher from South Africa that got funded by Desmos to do a research on the impact of solar radiation modification on droughts and extreme climate events, also the impact on agriculture. And we found that in this model scenario, solar radiation modification would work to reduce significantly the increases in temperature globally and over Southern Africa and over Africa as a whole. And this means, in other words, that solar radiation modification can slow down global warming. When we look at the rainfall changes, we found that over East Africa and over Central Africa, solar radiation modification would reduce change in rainfall to a level that is comparable to a historical period. And which means, in other words, we would say solar radiation modification is effective in stabilizing change in rainfall over these two regions. But when you look at the West Africa and Southern Africa, we found that there are few regions where solar radiation modification will decrease rainfall to lower levels compared to historical periods. However, when we look at the change in rainfall, it doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to have more droughts or we're going to have more floods. It only means that the rainfall is changing, and we also need to look into soil moisture and evaporation if you want to see what will be the impacts on droughts. Also, looking at these variables, it's important because they are the variables that are important for plants. So far, this is the study that we did, and we plan to look at the dynamics that are causing the change in rainfall over Southern Africa to further our understanding in these changes in rainfall.
We think that if we maintain a sense of optimism and ambition, then we are in a position to really change the way the world deals with SRM, make sure developing countries are central, nudge the balance in favour of equity and evidence, and we think the time to act is now.
This has been an overlooked and underfunded space for years, and the people you heard from are really the rebels and heroes really in this space, because they have thrived despite so little financial support, often cultural and intellectual support within their institutions. I mean, this work was even vilified for a long time as potentially creating a moral hazard against decarbonizing the economy. And so people who dedicated their careers to this did so often at great risk. And frankly, we just don't have the luxury anymore of putting off this research. It's literally existential. I know that word gets overused, but it is about the existence of our species and the rest of the species on this planet. For some of you who've been fortunate in the business world and with your own entrepreneurial pursuits, the checks that these folks need to continue to support the research, to develop these tools that will literally save hundreds of millions of lives and preserve plant and animal life as we know it on this planet, is well within the reach of the kind of giving that you're already doing elsewhere. And we hope we can count on you as supporters in this space alongside us.
So you've heard from my colleagues, you see the quality, the significance, the dedication of the work onto these topics. But relative to the field of climate change science more broadly, there's actually been very few published studies on this topic. And the existing base of research that we have is insufficient, as you've heard today, to really provide adequate support for informed decision-making. The reality is most of the scholarship to date has been through these individual efforts. maybe kind of a collection of ad hoc and in the big picture, relatively small scale efforts to look at these things. And part of that is because of the funding. So thankfully, due to private funding sources, some of the work that we've heard about today has been able to be accomplished. But really, there needs to be, I think, a much broader scale, better funded, coordinated program.
I wanted to kind of weigh in with what the dynamics are currently of the resources in the space. So globally, the level of funding for all of the research in this category is probably in the neighborhood of $10 to $12 million a year. And you could see the scope of work required. And so the leverage on initial funding in the next year or two is extraordinarily high. And the money that's gone in to the space, privately over the past decade, has been the catalyst for what's here today. And so, so if we're able to help lift that funding level, it does catalyze movement in the public sector. And ultimately, we will need a partnership of private and public sector to push this forward. The other thing I'll say about the space is it is not a commercial space. Chris referred to that too. It is very early in the science, and the nature of the solution is one of a public good. It's more like a defense application than anything else. We're not likely to see a commercial market for it in the traditional sense early on. And so it means that, that non-commercial funding is really important to getting things off the ground in this particular category. And the other piece is that it's incredibly interdisciplinary. So the things we need to know go from the scale of nanoparticles all the way to the entire planet, and they cross basic physics all the way through social science and some of the most complex questions of human nature. And so that part of it means too that, you know, each of these tracks, from Sean's work with aerosols to the big global climate models, we need to push those forward, and they interplay with each other. There are signs that that government is inclined to be helpful, and that this work actually can help drive some essential investments in climate observation and climate prediction. And we've had some success in SilverLining with bipartisan cooperation in this area in a way that brings some of the unhelpful sides of the equation to the table to talk about climate and to think about climate in a different way. And so on that note, I'll say that I really hope that for those of you who've remained on the call, thank you. And I do hope that you'll be able to continue to think about and possibly support this field of work as one of high leverage, high urgency, and a place that may help catalyze sort of the needed other parts of the ecosystem to pick up.